Well, good morning to our audience in Mexico and good afternoon to all those connected in Europe. COVID-19 has affected not only our daily lives and routines, I hope everybody washed their hands, but it is having important implications in international politics and the global order. I'm Érika Ruiz Sandoval, and this is the first online episode of the EU-Mexico Think Tank Dialogue Initiative. Today, we will be talking about the response to the COVID-19 crisis in the European Union and Latin America, as well as its geopolitical implications and future developments. To better understand this scenario, we will talk to Blockmans, Director ad interim of the Center for European Policy Studies, as well as Horacio Saavedra, member of the Mexican Council of International Affairs. We will also have the perspectives of Kvorning Lassen, Deputy Director at Europeum, Institute for European Policy, and Ilán Bizberg, who is a professor and researcher at the Colegio de México. On the COVID-19 crisis, the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Josep Borrell, has said that the European Union must remain a unifying factor by promoting joint efforts with China and the United States to address the pandemic and its consequences. Furthermore, Mr. Borrell has stated that only if the European Union, China, and the United States pull in the same direction can the G20 and the United Nations make a real difference. For our audience in Latin America, Stephen, can you tell us why is the European Union's role so important for the multilateral system in this global crisis?
Sure. Thank you very much, first of all, for having me. It's an honor to be able to talk to you transatlantically. Let me first start by saying that this public health disaster is affecting every nation's society and body politic. And what you see in phase one of the corona crisis is that each government essentially has its own reflex. Here in Europe, many just watched closely at first to see how autocratic China was dealing with the virus. Reports of local authorities suppressing information after the outbreak and even destroying proof of the virus has reminded many Europeans of the Soviet Union's disastrous handling of the 1986 nuclear explosion at Chernobyl. And similarly, I think many European citizens were not surprised by the Kremlin's initial reaction to the situation in Russia, one of denial, one of deflection, and in fact a convenient excuse to push through a quasi-referendum to change the Russian constitution and allow Putin to stay in power until 2036. I mean, the Kremlin has since, of course, adapted to progressing realities. But here in Europe, I think the democratic self-congratulation didn't last very long, because after the initial denial phase, China launched a very impressive mobilization that apparently contained the danger. And European observers started, in fact, worrying whether their own governments would be able to organize the kind of social will and capacity to act in time to flatten the curve, as the saying goes. And political leaders across Europe realized too late that they had wasted precious preparation time. So when the medical emergency hit a chronically unstable environment in which every bit of information is weaponized for political gain, a well-intentioned but ill-advised Prime Minister of Italy, Giuseppe Conte, in my mind took one misstep after another. And in fact, Italy has become Europe's first casualty of poor crisis management. Very different reaction in France, where you saw President Emmanuel Macron heavily relying on the authority of science, of statistics, but declaring that we are at war and mobilizing all manpower and resources to save lives through state coercion by going into full lockdown, but not until after the first round of municipal elections were held. In Brexit Britain, you saw that they instinctively distanced themselves from the mayhem on the continent, kept calm, carried on, until growing doubts in the ruling Conservative Party over Prime Minister Boris Johnson's laconic bluff at first pushed him to confront the seriousness of the situation. And in fact, we all know what has happened with him since. I mean, my point is that 3.5 months after the outbreak in Wuhan, the death toll surpassed that of China, the death toll, that is, and government in phase 2 of the virus progression, most EU member states are in that phase 2 right now, will increasingly do what Asian countries with the experience of fighting SARS and MERS have done before, which is to introduce maximum restrictions on the freedom of movement to reduce pressure on hospitals. And governments everywhere have, in fact, taken measures that previously seemed unimaginable. They've closed borders, they've clung on to their personal protection equipment, mouth masks, etc., ventilators, etc. And that retreat to national solutions is, of course, bad news for multilateralism, to get to the answer of your question. But then again, this instinctive self-preservation is only one side of the story as well, because what the corona outbreak also marks is, at least in Europe, a return of fact-based politics in much of Europe, not all. Countering the spread of disinformation, and in fact, Josep Borrell, you referred to his earlier statements, has come out quite vocally in this respect, fighting disinformation specifically from China and from Russia. It has also pushed, in Europe at least, populists and cyber warriors a bit more into the background, although they keep operating, and it's a constant battle, of course. So, as the virus affects all EU countries, be it at different stages on the infection curve, it calls for crisis management at the European level and, of course, at the global level. I think the COVID-19 crisis clearly shows that transnational challenges such as the corona crisis require multilateral solutions. And here we could say that the EU can help. Multilateralism is in its DNA. And in fact, Borrell has, as I mentioned, to other states, to China and to Russia, to the US. Of course, the EU has offered consular protection through its civil protection mechanism, so as to airlift EU citizens, more than 22,000 of them, back and return them back to their home countries. But I think what is becoming increasingly clear is that the role of the WHO has come very clearly into the spotlight. Obviously, the WHO can be a part of the solution by providing guidelines and information about how governments and other authorities should act abroad. But it's also become part of the problem, it seems, because when the crisis broke out in Wuhan, Beijing seemed to have succeeded from the start in steering the WHO, the World Health Organization, which both receives funding from China and is dependent on the Communist Party on many levels, in fact, to get access to the country until the Director General, Tedros Adhanom, visited President Xi at the end of January. Before that, the WHO was uncritically repeating information from the Chinese authorities, ignoring warnings from Taiwanese doctors, etc. So there is a role here to be played, I think, for the EU, its member states. The EU is not a member of the WHO. Its member states, for Mexico, other Latin American countries, to share information, to lobby within the WHO to improve transparency of its own governance structures, its funding, perhaps. One final point in fighting fake news and disinformation. And I think on the bilateral level, the EU and Mexico, as part of their trade agreement, which was concluded in 2018 and which will become part of the new global agreement for the two parties, can cooperate more on research on new medicines and also facilitate trade in medical advices. And in a broader Latin American context, this could be replicated with CARIFORUM, with the Andean community, and with Chile, each of which have similar agreements with the EU.
Thank you very much. Now let's go to Dr. Ilán Bizberg to have the perspective from this side of the Atlantic concerning the response of the COVID-19 crisis in Latin America and its geopolitical implications. What do you think are the main issues to consider? And based on the common values such as democracy and human rights between Latin America and Europe, are there any relevant points of collaboration between both parts to address the global pandemic in the multilateral system? You have 5 minutes, Dr. Bizberg.
Inviting me to this webinar. Well, as everybody knows, I believe since 10, 15 years ago, Latin America, with the exception of Mexico in a sense, more and more on China in terms of its exports, commodities, and direct investment. No one has seen direct investment, strong direct investment of China in Argentina and Brazil and in other countries in Latin America. And now we have been actually receiving more and more aid from this country from China in the coronavirus crisis, while the United States is receding totally, as we know, since Trump's election, and Europe, very understandably, because it's dealing with its own emergency, is concentrated on itself. This in itself is very significant. Is a very significant geo-economic change, no? That obviously will have, it already is having an impact on geopolitics, no? Where China is becoming an important actor in Latin America, a more and more important actor, becoming a dominant actor in Latin America. And nevertheless, I think this is something that will be raised by other participants. I would like to talk about the idea, what the idea of Europe means for Latin America, and what's the idea of what's the model that's being vehiculated in a sense, that's being carried by China, which is a very different model. What impressed us most in Latin America, and Mercosur was one of the responses towards this idea, is a democratic model, no? A democratic, liberal model, preserving individual rights. And now a country, a new hegemon is becoming, is having more and more impact on our lives in Latin America, which is China. Even before the outbreak of the current pandemic, two contrasting models have been presented to global society and to Latin America. The authoritarian, exemplified by China, which has been rapidly developing its economy, lifting 600 million of its inhabitants out of poverty, dramatically expanding its infrastructure, ensuring that the emerging new middle class has access to the comforts of the developed world, and this in just 30 years. The leaders of this model claim that democracy and individual rights and liberties would jeopardize the state's ability to continue this impressive process. The majority of the population in China accepts this premise. Democracy and individual liberties can wait. The most important thing is that a country that until recently was poor was getting rich at a surprising speed. That the values that are at the base of democratic societies could be delayed in exchange for economic development. And this is the model that's being more and more under discussion in Latin America, even from the right parties and from the left parties. In a sense, left parties some left intellectuals have been saying, well, you see, this is real socialism, what's happening in China. Finally, Russia was a disaster, but China is showing the way. Facing this model is basically Europe nowadays, when the United States has abandoned being the leader of the free world or of the democratic world. So democratic countries. Yes, I will. So in a sense, for us, Europe is very important. Europe is very important not only as an aid. Of course, I think aid will come when they go through the first stage of the epidemic, but especially from ideological terms. It's an open, plural political system, an extensive welfare state, and broad individual liberties model, which is losing terrain, which is losing ground towards a autocratic model. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both for giving this overview. Now, the European Union is a global example of collaboration for peace, stability, and prosperity. But the COVID-19 has posed important challenges to its governance. Christian, what are the lessons you consider other parts of the world can learn from this to advance regional cooperation efforts as this global health crisis keeps evolving? You have 5 minutes.
It's an honor having this opportunity to reach an audience that normally I don't have the privilege to interact with. In order to answer the question, I briefly want to outline a bit before the situation in the EU and how the EU is handling the crisis, because without that, it's hard to also mention which lessons can be derived from it to other regional initiatives. As it is right now in the EU, the crisis has deepened some existing fault lines or divisions that were especially highlighted during the migration crisis. The response within the EU from its member states towards the EU is very different. In Central and Eastern Europe, you have Eurosceptics who favor Russia and China, such as the Czech President Zeman or the Prime Minister Andrej Babiš. Whereas in the West and in the North, such as Denmark, Euroscepticism is not part of the public discourse towards this crisis. So within the Union, you have various voices seeking either to capitalize on the crisis for domestic political gain, and you have some member states who have internalized the knowledge also amongst its populations that public health is not part of the EU competencies, and therefore the EU is not really responsible for handling the crisis. That being said, as Stephen also mentioned, a crisis such as the current one is an occasion that mandates initiatives and frameworks such as the EU to act naturally. And the EU did act in regards to this crisis. Already on the 26th of January, the European Centre for Disease Control alerted the health authorities in the various member states that COVID-19 presented a serious risk to the EU. And at the same time, EU officials asked the member states if they needed assistance with the acquisition of essential medical equipment such as ventilators, masks, protective gear, and so on and so forth. but the member states declined the offer of assistance back then, and at the same time reassured the EU that they were perfectly capable of handling the crisis, which in retrospect they evidently weren't. Some have handled it better than others, but it would be a stretch to say that the general preparedness was adequate. Part of this is, of course, that ever since the financial crisis in some countries, but then particularly during the migration crisis, Euroscepticism, and I wouldn't even hesitate to say Europhobia, has become a permanent fixture of domestic politics. And often domestic popularity is achieved at the EU's expense. So the EU has begun to act as the other, against which domestic politicians can frame themselves. And naturally, that doesn't make for a very strong or proactive or influential European Union within the various nations. If the support for the EU is incredibly low, then you won't have anyone championing the voices of this union. And at the same time, it also makes the cooperation within the European Union problematic. So I think first and foremost, it's important to address this mismatch, not just within the EU, but also in other countries, because if you are to have regional cooperation, to be proactive, influential, powerful, then evidently you also need to empower it with the competencies to handle it. And right now the EU has no competencies within public health. That lies purely within the member states, which arguably is also an acceptable thing. But if that also means that timely warnings such as the one the EU gave to the member states already on the 26th of January go unheeded, then evidently something is not functioning here.
Please wrap up, Christian.
Okay, yeah. So in terms of what can be derived from the crisis as lessons, I think as Stephen mentioned, we're now facing a crossroads in terms of nationalism against multilateralism. And this crisis highlights very keenly that multilateralism is essential, not just to dealing with the current pandemic, where it's extremely important that countries coordinate their efforts, both to the benefit of themselves, but also to their neighbors and to other countries, because we live in such an interconnected and globalized world. But it's also essential for the EU to finally step up, not just from being a peace and prosperity project, but also becoming a geopolitical actor, like Ursula von der Leyen's Commission has stated its objective is. Because, as was mentioned by the other speakers, the US decline is arguably accelerating both under Trump, but also especially under this crisis. And that leaves a void that right now China and Russia seek to exploit, but which the EU is not fully capable of stepping up into, because it is so fragmented, because its support is so varying even within its own member states. And this vacuum that US hegemony and eroded leadership leaves ultimately mandates the EU to take on the mantle itself, because if it did that, it would be capable of it. The European project is still by far the most attractive ones of the potential global leaders. So I think I'll wrap up with that, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. Now, coming back to Latin America, Horacio, are there any other specific geopolitical challenges that will need to be analyzed during the COVID-19 crisis? For example, in terms of migration and the role of the United States, is there any space to share mutual lessons, best practices with the European Union? You have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Érika. Thank you for this initiative to the European Union. Thank you to our audience. Yes, the first statement is that there's no border for coronavirus. And we already have this experience in the case of Europe, in the case of Asia, and it's the same thing for Latin America. And regarding migration, we have two big populations of migrants that are located in the continent and face similar challenges. We can see the migrants in the US, especially the undocumented migrants. They really are scared. They could be deported, but they could be infected. So, and in that scenario, there's no borders for coronavirus. All those migrants in danger to be deported, they could be back to Mexico. Some of them are already in the way to Central America. I don't know if they are infected. We don't know if they could be early or quick in their countries. But the thing is, they face the same challenge in the US as in their countries of origin. For example, healthcare. If they were as undocumented migrants in the US, they have no access to public care, at least not officially. We know that there's a lot of assistance in the US. Now there's fraternity, but officially they don't have access to the healthcare system in the US. But if they are coming back to their countries, we are not sure that Central America or even Mexico has enough beds for the people infected or even medicine. So we faced that challenge in North America, but it's the same thing in South America with about 4.5 million of migrants of Venezuela. Most of them are in Colombia and Peru. In Colombia, they were welcome. They were very welcome. At the first moment, it was the same case in Peru, but now in other regions, I don't want to blame some country to be let's say not so welcoming with the migrants, but now the positions are changing. And why is that? We face in Latin America social tensions last year, at the end of the year, in October. You could remember all these protests regarding social care, regarding transport, politics, economics, and the Venezuelan migrants, they were already there, and some of them were presented as part of the problem. I don't think it is, but they were presented as that. It's a matter of our perception. As Steven said, we have this problem in Latin America that we are not really focused on politics or public policy based on data. We are more based now in perceptions, and we come from this perception of a big political division in Latin America, and now we have those migrants facing this problem in the case of Venezuela, and now they don't know what to do. They lose their job. Maybe if they were in Argentina, they lose a job. They don't have the access if they are in Ecuador. Ecuador is having a lot of problems with the healthcare system. Most of them sent remittances to their country of origin. In that case, Venezuela, they can't send money anymore to the family. So they don't see a solution. So most of them are coming back to Venezuela.
Okay. Thank you very much, Horacio. Now I'm going to ask a single question to all of you, and then you'll have 3 minutes to give your comments. This crisis has been initially addressed in an uncoordinated way. However, today it is clear that no country or region will be able to solve it on its own. How can this crisis be a new global opportunity to advance peace and to reinvigorate the partnership between Latin America in general and Mexico in particular, and the EU to overcome together this pandemic crisis? We'll go in the same order. So please, Stephen.
Yeah, well, thank you. At the end of my introductory remarks, I made 3 proposals in this respect. One for the EU and Mexico would be, of course, to tap into the 2018 trade deal, which they agreed, and which resonates the same type of contents as the EU has agreed to with CARIFORUM, with Chile, with the Andean community. And that is to ramp up research, cooperate on research on new medicine, and also facilitate trade in medical equipment. The second would be, of course, to work as nations in a coordinated manner through the WHO, so as to balance out its funding, which is heavily tilted towards China, and also review its governance system. I wanted to react by using my last minute and a half to some of the comments which are also in the chat box, and which resonate with the points that Christian also made. Why is it that for the European Union, this crisis is again framed as an existential one, but not for, say, the US or for China or for Mexico? I think it's an essential question, because it comes back with every crisis, whether it's migration crisis, Eurozone crisis, Brexit, etc. And it needs to be better understood, not soberly, and not in an emotional way. Because it's a bit like Nostradamus's prediction of the end of the world, right? Always about to happen for reasons newly revised, but of course never happens. So what's the problem? I think maybe because the EU doesn't fit, the mold of a classical statehood, and that people have expectations, dreams, and hopes projected on the EU as an almost magical savior. Whereas China has been around for 3 millennia, and the US appears to have settled its question on its existence as a polity in a civil war. Now, I think there's a lot of disinformation there, and I've touched upon this as well, which feeds this unshakable tenet, it seems, of media, fake media as well, that Europe is inevitably collapsing, to boost their own case, their own confidence in a way. And I think we should have a clear view on this and look at what the EU is doing in a functional way within its limits of competences. Christian talked about this at length. And despite a late start, where I think indeed, it was not merited on the EU side to receive that type of criticism, it has ramped up, its response in terms of border management, in terms of fiscal discipline, in terms of relaxation of state aid rules, in terms of big boost for budgets. And so I think if the real EU continues to do a decent job in managing interdependence in Europe, which is something that not a lot of criticism or pundits are interested in, but if you look at that, then I think you'll see that again with this crisis, the European Union will reinvigorate parts of its existence. A major problem, and maybe someone else can talk about this, is of course the pandemic authoritarianism that you see happening in around the world, but also in Hungary, soon in Poland. This is a burning crisis which needs to be addressed.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bizberg.
Okay, thank you. I agree with you, Stephen. I do hope that Europe can come out from this crisis reinvigorated, because the question of the pandemic, it's obvious. It was already said. It's an international problem. It started in China, as everybody knows, and it has been expanding to the rest of the world at impressive speed. So the solution cannot be just like the solution for the global heating, global warming, and the ecological crisis we're in is international. It has to be international. The solution, the problem is international. The problem is a world problem. So the solution has to be a world dictated and world. It has to be a global solution. We're very far from this, no? Obviously. Nevertheless, Europe is very important because it's the most significant and the most successful collective agreement and collective union, a collective a possibility to deal with questions that englobe many countries. No, so it is a model. No? It is a model that that is very important for us to try to copy in order to solve things like problems like this epidemic. The solution for the epidemic, what will happen when a vaccine will be developed? Will there be a fight between all the countries to get to it? Like the United States already tried to buy the company that produces it in Germany. Will that be the next round of actions by all the countries, or will it be something like the European Union, which can act collectively? You know? So it's really very important. It's very important. We are outside from Europe. We are very worried about tensions between Europe, although we see interesting developments like Germany helping Italy and France by having having patients transfers from Italian and from French hospitals to German hospitals. So we do see a cooperation, although there is a obvious every country is dealing with itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Christian, please.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks to both my fellow speakers for their interventions that were incredibly interesting, but also to all the wonderful and interesting questions that has come in the chat. I think personally, my response will echo Stephen's very much, which was very eloquent, in the sense that we need to view this crisis from a different perspective than whether or not this will be the time that the EU will finally fragment and fall. Of course, right now there is a renewed push for nationalism and against multilateralism, given the fact that every single country's measures revolve around closing off the country, putting it on lockdown, putting it into quarantine. But that doesn't necessarily mean that from a long-term perspective, it legitimates or empowers nationalist voices. I think it's interesting to think of ways, and this is also one of the questions that I saw, to envision what the EU can actually do, both in terms of slowly opening up societies again, but also in ways in which it can bring its soft power and economic power to bear as we eventually start exiting the crisis. Because as it was mentioned by Ilán, when a vaccine becomes available, we will essentially either face a gold rush towards acquiring the vaccine, or we will somehow do it in a more orderly manner, so to speak. And it's evident in this case that if the EU acts as an entity rather than individual countries, large and small, fighting for the acquisition of an adequate supply of a vaccine, that the EU would be magnitudes more successful than any individual country could be by virtue of its economic capabilities and global influence. So I think in terms of what the EU can do, this would be a very low-hanging fruit for the EU to pick, so to speak. Basically taking the leadership in terms of vaccine acquisition and also in terms of disseminating it in a fair and just way. Aside from that, there was one more question that I personally like because it's a bit of a pet peeve of mine, and that is whether this crisis can be a game changer towards a more sustainable world. I think that is also an incredibly important question to focus on, because within the EU, we already see certain countries, such as the V4 countries, arguing that the European Green Deal needs to be scrapped in order to provide short-term economic stimulus to the member states in their economic recovery after the crisis. Whereas you have other countries, such as the Scandinavian ones, arguing that the European Green Deal and the push towards a sustainable future that is carbon neutral is essential in terms of economic recovery and stimulus. And obviously within the EU, that is going to be the next battlefield now that migration is essentially, I wouldn't say lost, but more or less settled on a very restrictionist path. So evidently, it does present an opportunity, because there will be a dire need for public investment. There will be a dire need for economic stimulus. And given the way that especially sustainable financial megatrends are pointing, those solutions to economic recovery do lie in sustainability, because right now fossils, even present day, such as coal, are already not profitable. They are only profitable due to heavy subsidization. And evidently, if we want the economic recovery to benefit the citizens rather than those with vested interest in the status quo, governments will need to be visionary about how they facilitate the economic recovery. And once again, that points towards an increased role of not just the EU, but also other regional initiatives. Because just like with this crisis, the crisis of climate change is something that can only be solved globally and in cooperation, as Ilán mentioned. So there are a lot of questions, and I hope we can answer, if not all of them, then most of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Christian.
Thank you.
Horacio?
I can see that everybody in the panel is in favor of cooperation and multilateralism, but I would like to hear somebody from the US or somebody from the UK. That could be interesting maybe for our next panel. So, and I would like to think positive. What's interesting in Europe? Europe experimented 2 world wars, but also the Cold War. So they have this historic experience that makes cooperation a necessity. And I think we have to learn from that. We didn't have that experience, for example, in the case of the US, in the case of Latin America. We have to learn from that experience. But also, what I think is very important now is to think in long-term policies, because we are having, in the case of Latin America, a lot of debate, a lot of politics regarding the short-term regarding nationalism, what is important for us, and we're thinking in ourselves. But I think this is also an important moment to think in the region, to think in the world, and to think in international cooperation, and that means also budgets. We don't have to focus only our national budgets on national efforts. Of course, is the priority now, but also I think we have to be focused more on programs regarding international cooperation. Now we have the chance to work together about the pandemic, but also about science, and also regarding how could we have better governments and better results in many different topics, and to change this vision and go back to this positive image of integration, that the globalization is not anymore a bad thing, is not the evil, is not the ghost. So globalization could be positive for us, and the solution is international cooperation. I would like to hear, of course, it could be also important if the European Union has a program, a budget to support Latin America, especially with credits, medicine, and technical cooperation. I think it could be appropriate to know about it. And what I think is also important is thinking new schemes of cooperation, not anymore this north-south cooperation idea that we are the south and we are the poor and we receive, and the north have to send the money and the solutions. We have to think in horizontal cooperation, and I think we have very positive experience in that sense with European Union. For example, in the case of migration, the European Union is supporting the migrants in the border between Venezuela and Brazil. I would like to hear some European Union initiative in that sense, also more working together in cooperation. Also, Fundación Carolina is working in that kind of horizontal cooperation in Latin America. And what I think is very important now is all the countries involved. Now the center of the epidemic is the US. It was China, it could be another region. So, and I think United States, Europe, Latin America, and China, we are not enemies, we're partners, and we have to behave like that.
Thank you very much, Horacio. Quick announcement regarding the effects of COVID-19 crisis on climate change policies. Be another webinar to discuss such issues further on April 28th. So that's that. So thank you very much for all your responses. We have a bunch of questions. So thank you very much to our audience for sending all these questions that are very interesting. And as Christian said, maybe we won't have time to go through all of them. So I'm going to read them aloud, and please pick one, and you'll have 1 minute to answer your favorite one. So Jack Coste asks, what role should the EU play to stop Viktor Orbán authoritarian measures in Hungary? And how can the EU avoid that other countries' leaders take similar steps towards authoritarianism while the COVID-19 crisis takes place? Jorge Gallegos asks, what do you think should be the exit strategy from the total quarantines? Many countries cannot afford to shut down their whole economies. Are there plans for selective quarantines, or what models are you looking at given the fact that vaccines still are being developed and would not be available for a while? E. Mejia asks, what should be the role of the EU and its member states in sustaining democratic values while they fight themselves against the pandemic and deal with situations of authoritarianism as in Hungary? Angelica Guzman asks, do you think this is the beginning of a real fragmentation crisis in the European Union? Raul Sanchez asks, how could Mexico and the European Union cooperate to face the coronavirus crisis? Herzog S. asks, a decentralized response is not necessarily a bad thing. In Mexico, governors moved faster than the federal government, and in Germany, the decentralized health system has been a key factor in mobilizing testing capacity. How can we balance the need for centralized coordination of information, research, and economic support, and decentralized mobilization of capacities and innovations? Mauricio Gonzalez asks, what could be done to improve the health systems in Latin America? Monica Laborda asks, what do you think about the Dutch lockdown method? Does it work? Herzog asks again, how can we ensure that China's blatant politicization of the WHO, for example, in totally excluding Taiwan, whose handling of the crisis has been far superior to China's, can be countered in the future? Emmanuel Winter asks, can this crisis be a game changer for a more sustainable world? How can we take this crisis as a chance to strengthen global issues like climate change and others? Alicia Bendaño asks, how can we be more effective in balancing the needs of citizens as a government and pressures of the economy as an interest that works against us? Let's try to be as dynamic as possible. So, Stephen, which one would you like to answer?
I'd set my eyes on even another question because I touched upon many of these issues before, but something we haven't discussed is the economic and political response in the EU and among Latin American countries with a view to different trade winds as we come out of this crisis. To me, it's clear that the global economy was ripe for a recession even before the corona pandemic struck. We've seen, a decade-long trend of rising non-tariff barriers, mainly by China and the US. We've seen stock markets that were overheated. We've seen advanced economies heading already for a slowdown. We've seen the trade wars initiated by Trump, which have disrupted supply chains. Now, the stock market has crashed and the recession has become inevitable, undermining the multilateral trade system. So what can the EU and Latin America do is something that someone asks. We've stressed, of course, the fact that the EU is a champion of multilateralism, but still the EU will not be able to take the lead in restoring relevance to the WTO without support of the other members. And here, Mexico and other Latin American countries could rally behind some of the reform proposals that they share in the context of a paralyzed appellate body. And fight non-tariff barriers, maybe strike, just like the EU has done with Japan and the US, plurilateral type of agreements. That one was on industrial subsidies, perhaps, plurilateral agreements in other fields. For example, medical could generate, the kind of upward convergence needed to prepare for a truly multilateral solution in the WTO context. Sector-specific, developed with their own multi-party interim appeal arbitration arrangements. That could be a way to save the WTO and maybe give a new boost to trade multilateralism after we get out of this crisis.
Okay, thank you very much. Ilán?
Yes, well, I'm not a specialist in epidemics, obviously, but what we have seen is about the question about how are we going to come out from this, from confinement. I think Taiwan, Singapore have shown the way. Testing, no, actually we should have tested much earlier. All of the countries should have done it. Actually, Germany is doing that, and even authoritarian Hungary and Czech Republic are testing more and more people in order to isolate the people who are infected. Then I think this epidemic shows us the next threat, no? Which is global warming, the crisis. No, I think in a sense, it's very hard to say, but it's if we would have waited 20 years more to have the real threat of global warming, it would be too late. Now maybe this crisis will wake us up and show us that we have to do something against global warming. In a sense, this epidemic is part of this pressure human beings are imposing on nature. It's the first measure. It's the first example of what will happen in 20, 30 years time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Christian.
All right. I took a liking to the question regarding the exit strategy from the total quarantine, since many countries have various pain thresholds economically that makes continued lockdown untenable. I think in terms of what individual countries could do, I would like to reference Denmark's current model for slowly opening society, which right now involves that from the 15th of April, institutions targeting young children, such as preschool, child-caring institutions, and lower classes of primary school are slowly opening up, since small children are the most resistant to the virus from what we know. And in order to somehow also alleviate the parents economically, who have so far shouldered a lot of the burden of child caring during this crisis. What Denmark is then doing is that they carefully monitor the developments, and then every 4 weeks, so every single month, they will evaluate the progression of the crises and how the slow opening of society has impacted it. And based on that evaluation, they will then open up gradually other sectors as well. But obviously, this time frame also reveals that the crisis will take a long time. The current Danish estimates are that in order for society to fully return to normal, so far that is possible, is between 1.5, maybe even 2 years.
Okay.
That might be highly said, but I'll wrap up quickly. In terms of what exit strategy from a regional perspective is necessary, then obviously it mandates countries to coordinate, because it won't work if one country opens up if the situation is terrible in the neighboring countries. So this alone will create an impetus for regional cooperation, but whether or not it will then be internalized into promoting regional cooperation amongst populations, I'm a bit more skeptical. I would like to believe that this is the wake-up call we need in order to tackle climate change, but I'm also aware and fearful that it might be another nail in the coffin that will just prolong the time it will take for the world to react to more existential crises such as climate change.
Thank you very much, Horacio.
Yes, well, what I think is we have to see our current challenges. We cannot think in the past anymore. In the case of Latin America, for example, in the case of demographics, what can we learn from Europe? Most of Europe has a urban scenario, urban challenges. In Latin America, most of the people live in the cities or close to the cities. So we have to focus the public policies and the public investment in urban solutions, healthcare solutions, private sector solutions, and of course the public sector. We're living now in the cities in Latin America, and another thing that we can see in Europe, and this is also growing in Latin America, is the relevance of the middle class. We were thinking in the past that in that idea that the most of the population of Latin America was poor. Still, we're having a large, unfortunately, a lot a large poor population, but we have an emerging middle class, and we have to cover also this middle class, to protect the middle class. And that doesn't mean also the health system, but also the economic activities of the middle class. We're not thinking in that. We are only thinking in the past and in the vulnerable, which is important, which is the priority, but we have to think in all population. So, and to close, I would like to say that it's time to go beyond this time of nationalism and nativism, what we see in Latin America, and it's time again for cooperation and fraternity. And I think European Union has the infrastructure, but also the vision and the philosophy, and that's what we need now. Also a vision to cooperate and not think only in ourselves.
Thank you very, very much for this discussion, which throws light on the geopolitical problems that the EU, Mexico, and Latin America will continue facing after the coronavirus, but most importantly, to the opportunities both have to collaborate in overcoming them. We thank our audience for their time. We're sorry we couldn't read all the questions, but we invite you to fill in a survey that will be sent by email. And we also invite you to connect next April 14th to discuss on fake news, disinformation, and the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you all for participating. It was a great pleasure.